8-year-old Emma Martinez sat quietly in the hospital bed, her small fingers wrapped around a worn teddy bear that had seen better days. The pediatric wing of St. Mary's General Hospital buzzed with its usual activity, but Emma remained unusually still for a child her age. Her dark eyes followed every movement in the hallway beyond her room's glass door, watching nurses in colorful scrubs hurry past with medicine carts and clipboards. Emma had been in the hospital for 3 days now, officially admitted for severe dehydration and malnutrition. Her stepfather, Derek Collins, had brought her in after she collapsed at school during lunch period. The story he told the admitting physician was simple and believable. Emma had been refusing to eat properly for weeks, probably due to some emotional issues following her mother's recent remarriage. Children often acted out during family transitions, the doctor had noted sympathetically. Derek sat in the chair beside Emma's bed, scrolling through his phone with practiced indifference. To any observer, he appeared to be a concerned stepfather keeping vigil over his sick stepdaughter. He made all the right gestures, bringing her small gifts from the hospital shop, reading to her from picture books, and engaging in pleasant conversation with the medical staff. The nurses often commented on how devoted he seemed, especially considering Emma wasn't his biological child. But Emma knew the truth that no one else could see. Behind Derek's caring facade lay a reality that had been her nightmare for the past 8 months, ever since her mother Sarah had married him and they had moved to his house on Maple Street. The house that looked so perfect from the outside, with its white picket fence and carefully maintained garden, had become Emma's prison. The bruises on Emma's ribs and back were carefully hidden beneath her hospital gown. Derek had become expert at inflicting pain in places that wouldn't be easily discovered. He had learned from his mistakes early in their twisted relationship, when a visible mark on Emma's arm had prompted uncomfortable questions from her teacher, Mrs. Henderson. Since then, Derek had been more careful, more calculated in his cruelty. Emma's mother Sarah worked double shifts at the local diner, often leaving home before Emma woke up and returning after she had gone to bed. Sarah was struggling to make ends meet and was grateful for Derek's offer to help care for Emma while she worked. She had no idea that her new husband's helpfulness masked something far more sinister. The food restrictions had started gradually. Derek would tell Sarah that Emma had already eaten when she asked about dinner. He would pack Emma inadequate lunches for school, claiming she preferred smaller portions. When Emma tried to tell her mother she was hungry, Derek would interrupt with stories about Emma being difficult about food, turning her legitimate complaints into what appeared to be typical childhood pickiness. As Emma lay in the hospital bed, she reflected on how she had ended up here. The morning she collapsed at school, she had been so weak from hunger that the room had started spinning during arithmetic class. She remembered Mrs. Henderson rushing to her side as everything went black, and then, waking up to paramedics asking her questions she was too dizzy to answer properly. Derek had arrived at the school within minutes of the nurse's phone call, his face a perfect mask of concern and confusion. He had scooped Emma up gently, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, that they would get her the help she needed. To everyone watching, he was the picture of a caring stepfather dealing with a family crisis. Now, as Emma watched Derek tap away on his phone, she caught glimpses of his true nature when he thought no one was looking. The cold calculation in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when nurses asked too many questions about Emma's home life, the subtle threats he whispered when medical staff left the room. "Remember what we talked about," he had murmured earlier that morning. "You're here because you haven't been eating properly. That's all anyone needs to know." Emma understood the implication perfectly. Derek had spent months conditioning her to understand that no one would believe her if she told the truth. He had systematically isolated her from potential sources of help, monitoring her interactions at school, discouraging friendships, and painting himself as the only adult who truly cared about her well-being. The hospital environment, however, presented new challenges for Derek's carefully constructed narrative. Here, Emma was under constant observation by trained medical professionals whose job was to notice things that others might miss. The nurses checked on her regularly, asked about her pain levels, observed her interactions with visitors, and documented everything in detailed charts. Nurse Rebecca Patterson was assigned to Emma's case on her second day in the hospital. Rebecca was a 28-year-old pediatric nurse with 6 years of experience working with children in various medical situations. She had seen enough cases of child abuse to recognize the warning signs, and something about Emma's case had immediately caught her attention. The first thing Rebecca noticed was Emma's hypervigilance. While most children in the hospital became more relaxed after a day or two, Emma remained constantly alert, her eyes tracking every movement in her room. She flinched slightly whenever Derek reached toward her, even for seemingly innocent gestures like adjusting her blanket or smoothing her hair. These were subtle reactions that most people would miss, but Rebecca's training had taught her to watch for such signs. Rebecca also observed the unusual dynamic between Emma and Derek. While Derek appeared attentive and caring, Emma never seemed to relax in his presence. Most children, even with non-biological caregivers they felt close to, would show some signs of comfort and security when that person was near. Emma showed none of these behaviors. Instead, she seemed to withdraw into herself whenever Derek was in the room. The medical team had run comprehensive tests on Emma to understand the extent of her malnutrition and dehydration. The results painted a concerning picture of chronic deprivation rather than acute illness. Emma's blood work showed signs of prolonged inadequate nutrition, and her weight was significantly below the normal range for a child her age. These findings were consistent with systematic neglect rather than a temporary eating problem. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the pediatrician overseeing Emma's care, had initially accepted Derek's explanation for Emma's condition. Children did sometimes develop eating disorders or refuse food during stressful family transitions. However, as Emma began to recover physically with proper nutrition and hydration, her behavioral patterns remained concerning. She was too quiet, too compliant, too careful in her responses to questions about home. Rebecca made it a point to spend extra time with Emma during her shifts. She would sit by Emma's bed and engage in gentle conversation, always careful not to ask direct questions that might put the child in an uncomfortable position. Instead, she would tell stories about other children she had cared for, read books aloud, or simply sit quietly while Emma drew pictures with the crayons Rebecca had brought from the pediatric activity room. During these interactions, Rebecca began to notice patterns in Emma's behavior that reinforced her growing concerns. Emma never asked for things directly, not for water when she was thirsty, not for help reaching something, not even for simple comfort measures like an extra pillow. This level of self-suppression was unusual for a child and suggested she had learned that making requests could lead to negative consequences. Rebecca also observed Emma's reaction to kindness. When Rebecca brought her a small stuffed animal from the hospital's donation box, Emma's eyes had filled with tears, as if such a simple gesture of care was unexpected and overwhelming. This response suggested that Emma was not accustomed to receiving kindness without strings attached. The turning point in Rebecca's assessment came during her third shift caring for Emma. Derek had stepped out to get coffee, leaving Emma alone for the first time since her admission. Rebecca took this opportunity to spend some one-on-one time with Emma, hoping to get a better sense of her emotional state without the potential influence of Derek's presence. As Rebecca sat beside Emma's bed, she noticed that the child's entire demeanor changed when Derek was not in the room. Emma sat up straighter, made more eye contact, and even smiled slightly when Rebecca showed her a picture book about animals. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her small shoulders, allowing her true personality to emerge even briefly. "You seem to feel better when it's just us," Rebecca observed gently, watching Emma's reaction carefully. Emma's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced toward the door as if checking to make sure they were truly alone. She nodded almost imperceptibly, a movement so small that someone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. This tiny acknowledgement confirmed Rebecca's suspicions that something was very wrong in Emma's home environment. A child who felt safe and secure with her caregiver would not show such dramatic behavioral changes based on that person's presence or absence. Rebecca knew she needed to proceed carefully, as making accusations without solid evidence could potentially make Emma's situation worse rather than better. Over the next few hours, Rebecca observed Emma more closely, documenting her findings in the nursing notes with careful professional language that captured her concerns without making direct accusations. She noted Emma's heightened anxiety in the presence of her stepfather, her reluctance to make requests for basic needs, and her significant behavioral changes when left alone. Rebecca also began to pay closer attention to Derek's interactions with Emma and the medical staff. She noticed that he always positioned himself where he could hear every conversation Emma had with hospital personnel. He frequently answered questions directed at Emma before she could respond herself, claiming that she was too shy or confused to speak for herself. These controlling behaviors added weight to Rebecca's growing concerns about the family dynamic. As Emma's physical condition improved with proper medical care, the medical team began discussing discharge plans. Derek expressed eagerness to take Emma home, emphasizing how much he had missed her and how worried the family had been about her health. He painted a picture of a loving home environment where Emma would receive the care and attention she needed to continue recovering. But Rebecca could see the fear in Emma's eyes whenever discharge was mentioned. While most children looked forward to going home after a hospital stay, Emma seemed to shrink into herself at the thought of leaving the safety of the medical environment. This reaction was another significant red flag that suggested home was not the safe haven it should be for a child. Rebecca knew that time was running out. Once Emma was medically stable, there would be no reason to keep her in the hospital, and she would be discharged back into what Rebecca increasingly suspected was an abusive environment. The challenge was finding a way to get Emma to communicate about her situation without putting her in danger or violating the trust that Rebecca had worked so hard to build. The solution would need to be subtle, something that would allow Emma to ask for help without Derek realizing what was happening. Rebecca had heard of cases where children had found creative ways to signal distress, and she began to think about how she might create an opportunity for Emma to do the same. Rebecca Patterson arrived for her fourth shift caring for Emma with a heavy heart and a determined mind. She had spent her days off researching child advocacy protocols and consulting with a former colleague who worked in pediatric social services. The more she learned about recognizing signs of abuse, the more convinced she became that Emma was living in a dangerous situation that required intervention. The challenge facing Rebecca was significant. She needed concrete evidence or a clear disclosure from Emma to initiate protective services involvement. Unfortunately, Emma had been conditioned by months of psychological manipulation to remain silent about her experiences. Derek had effectively isolated her from potential sources of help while maintaining a public image that made accusations seem implausible. During her research, Rebecca had learned about various methods children had used throughout history to signal distress when they couldn't speak openly about their situation. She had read about children leaving notes in library books, drawing disturbing pictures that caught teacher attention, and even using simple hand signals during video calls that alert adults had recognized as cries for help. Rebecca decided to create an opportunity for Emma to communicate safely about her situation. She knew that direct questions about abuse would likely be met with denial, both because Emma had been threatened into silence and because Derek was almost always present during their conversations. Instead, Rebecca needed to find a way to give Emma agency in deciding whether and how to ask for help. The morning of Rebecca's return shift, she noticed that Emma seemed more withdrawn than usual. Derek was present in the room, as he had been for most of Emma's stay, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there during previous visits. Derek's jaw was clenched, and he kept glancing at his phone with obvious irritation. Emma lay perfectly still in her bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if afraid to move or attract attention. Dr. Rodriguez arrived during morning rounds to check on Emma's progress. Her vital signs were stable, her hydration levels had improved significantly, and she had gained almost 2 pounds since admission. From a purely medical perspective, Emma was ready for discharge. Dr. Rodriguez discussed the discharge plan with Derek, emphasizing the importance of ensuring Emma received proper nutrition and follow-up care. Derek nodded enthusiastically at each instruction, asking thoughtful questions about Emma's dietary needs and expressing gratitude for the excellent care she had received. He mentioned that he had already stocked the house with nutritious foods and had arranged to take time off work to supervise Emma's transition back to normal activities. To anyone listening, Derek sounded like the ideal caregiver committed to Emma's well-being. But Rebecca watched Emma's reaction during this conversation and saw something that chilled her to the bone. As Derek spoke about taking Emma home and caring for her personally, Emma's hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly. She gripped her teddy bear more tightly, and her breathing became slightly more rapid. These were subtle signs of anxiety that would be easy to miss unless someone was specifically watching for them. After Dr. Rodriguez left, Derek excused himself to make some phone calls about Emma's homecoming. He told Emma he would be right back and reminded her to rest so she would have energy for going home the next day. As soon as he left the room, Emma's entire body seemed to deflate, as if she had been holding herself rigid through sheer willpower. Rebecca approached Emma's bed carefully, sensing that this might be her only opportunity to have an honest conversation without Derek's overwhelming presence. She pulled up the chair beside Emma's bed and sat down at eye level with the child, her voice gentle and non-threatening. "Emma, you seem worried about something," Rebecca said quietly. "Sometimes when I'm worried about things, it helps to talk to someone who cares about me. Is there anything you want to tell me?" Emma's eyes darted toward the door, checking to make sure Derek wasn't returning. She opened her mouth slightly, as if considering speaking, but then closed it again and shook her head. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, and Rebecca could see the internal struggle between wanting to ask for help and being afraid of the consequences. Rebecca tried a different approach. She had brought a small notebook and some colored pencils with her, thinking that Emma might find it easier to express herself through drawing or writing rather than speaking aloud. She placed these items on the bedside table where Emma could reach them. "Sometimes it's easier to write things down or draw pictures when we can't say them out loud," Rebecca said gently. "If there's ever anything you want to tell me, you could write it down or draw it. I would keep it private between us, just like when you tell a secret to your best friend." Emma looked at the notebook with interest, but her eyes kept returning to the door. Rebecca could see that Emma wanted to communicate but was terrified of being caught in the act. The level of fear Emma displayed was far beyond normal childhood shyness or anxiety. This was the fear of a child who had learned that speaking up could lead to severe consequences. Rebecca made a decision that would prove crucial to Emma's rescue. She leaned closer to Emma and, spoken barely above a whisper, ensuring that her words would not carry beyond the immediate vicinity of the bed. "Emma, if you're ever in danger or someone is hurting you, there are ways to ask for help without using words," Rebecca said carefully. "Some children who can't talk about their problems have found other ways to let safe adults know they need help." Emma's attention was completely focused on Rebecca now, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. Rebecca could see that she was getting through to the child, that Emma was understanding the lifeline being offered to her. If someone was hurting you and you couldn't tell anyone, you might put your hand flat against your chest, like this. Rebecca demonstrated the gesture slowly and clearly. "And then, if you needed help right away, you could show that signal to someone you trust, someone who would understand that you need them to help you." Emma watched the demonstration intently, her eyes never leaving Rebecca's hand as she performed the simple gesture. Rebecca repeated it once more, emphasizing how the flat palm pressed against the chest could be a silent way to communicate distress. "This would be our secret signal," Rebecca continued. "If you ever needed to tell me something was wrong but you couldn't use words, you could use the signal, and I would know that you need help. But only use it if it's safe to do so, and only if you really need someone to help you." Emma nodded slightly, showing that she understood both the gesture and the gravity of what Rebecca was offering. For the first time since Rebecca had met her, Emma made direct eye contact that lasted more than a fleeting moment. In those dark eyes, Rebecca saw a glimmer of hope mixed with desperate fear. The sound of Derek's footsteps in the hallway broke the moment. Emma immediately looked away and resumed her previous position, lying perfectly still and staring at the ceiling. Rebecca quickly moved the notebook and pencils to a less obvious position on the bedside table and stood up as Derek entered the room. "Everything okay in here?" Derek asked, his eyes moving between Rebecca and Emma as if sensing that something had occurred in his absence. His tone was friendly, but there was an undertone of suspicion that Rebecca found unsettling. "Everything's fine," Rebecca replied professionally. "I was just checking Emma's foresight and making sure she's comfortable. Her fluids are running well, and she seems to be responding nicely to the treatment." Derek nodded, but his eyes lingered on Emma for a long moment before he settled back into his chair beside her bed. Rebecca noticed that he positioned himself where he could observe both Emma and anyone who entered the room. It was a controlling behavior that reinforced her suspicions about the unhealthy dynamic between them. Throughout the rest of her shift, Rebecca found herself watching Emma more closely than ever. She was looking for any sign that Emma might try to use the signal they had discussed, but she was also careful not to create situations that might put Emma at risk if Derek became suspicious of their interaction. Emma, for her part, seemed to be processing what Rebecca had told her. Occasionally, Rebecca would catch Emma glancing at her own hand or touching her chest area absent-mindedly, as if practicing the gesture mentally. These small actions told Rebecca that Emma was seriously considering the option Rebecca had provided, which both encouraged and worried her. The challenge now was creating an opportunity for Emma to use the signal safely. Derek maintained his vigilant presence in Emma's room, rarely leaving for more than a few minutes at a time. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense when medical staff wanted to have private conversations with Emma, always managing to return just as such interactions were beginning. Rebecca began to understand that Derek's behavior was not coincidental. He had likely learned from experience that maintaining constant supervision was necessary to prevent Emma from disclosing information that could expose their home situation. This level of control suggested that Derek was well aware his treatment of Emma would not withstand scrutiny from authorities. As evening approached, Rebecca knew that her shift would be ending soon, and Emma's discharge was scheduled for the following morning. Time was running out for Emma to communicate her need for help within the safety of the hospital environment. Once she returned home with Derek, opportunities for disclosure would become virtually non-existent. Rebecca made several trips past Emma's room during the final hours of her shift, each time hoping to see if Emma might try to use the signal. During one such pass, she noticed that Derek had stepped into the bathroom adjoining Emma's room. For the first time all day, Emma was alone and visible from the hallway. Emma seemed to sense Rebecca's presence and looked toward the doorway. Their eyes met, and Rebecca could see the internal struggle playing out on Emma's face. Emma's hand moved slightly toward her chest, then stopped. She looked toward the bathroom door, listening to make sure Derek was still occupied, then looked back at Rebecca. In that moment, Emma made a decision that would change both their lives forever. With trembling hands, she placed her palm flat against her chest and held Rebecca's gaze with desperate intensity. The gesture lasted only a few seconds before Emma quickly dropped her hand and looked away, but it was enough. Rebecca felt her heart racing as she absorbed the significance of what had just happened. Emma had used their secret signal, confirming what Rebecca had suspected about the dangerous situation in Emma's home. The child was asking for help in the only way she could, trusting that Rebecca would understand and act on her silent plea. The sound of the bathroom door opening made both Emma and Rebecca resume normal behavior immediately. Derek emerged and looked between them with the same suspicious expression he had worn earlier. Rebecca maintained her professional demeanor, nodding politely at Derek before continuing down the hallway to complete her other patient care responsibilities. But, inside, Rebecca's mind was racing. Emma had confirmed that she was in danger and needed help. Now Rebecca faced the enormous responsibility of acting on this information in a way that would protect Emma rather than potentially making her situation worse. One wrong move could result in Emma being returned to an abusive environment, with Derek now aware that she had attempted to seek help. Rebecca knew that she needed to act quickly and decisively. Emma's discharge was less than 12 hours away, and, once she left the hospital, Rebecca might never have another opportunity to help her. The secret signal had been sent and received, but now came the most challenging part: figuring out how to rescue a child whose abuser had carefully constructed a facade of respectability that would make accusations difficult to prove. As Rebecca prepared to end her shift, she made a decision that would require all of her courage and professional expertise. She would not let Emma leave the hospital without ensuring that proper authorities were aware of the situation. The little girl had found the bravery to ask for help in the only way available to her, and Rebecca was determined to honor that trust by taking action. Rebecca Patterson stood at the nurse's station, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the computer screen displaying Emma's discharge orders. The words "patient ready for home discharge tomorrow morning" felt like a countdown timer to disaster. Emma's secret signal replayed in her mind, the desperate, silent plea for help that had lasted only seconds but conveyed volumes about the terror this 8-year-old child was living with. The hospital's protocol for suspected child abuse required documentation of specific indicators and consultation with the pediatric social worker. However, Rebecca faced a unique challenge. Emma's signal had been given in complete secrecy, with no witnesses and no physical evidence that would satisfy standard reporting requirements. Derek Collins had been masterfully careful in his abuse, leaving no visible marks and maintaining a public persona that made allegations seem unlikely to be believed. Rebecca checked the schedule and saw that Linda Morrison, the hospital's pediatric social worker, was still in the building. Linda had 15 years of experience investigating child welfare cases and had developed a reputation for her ability to identify abuse situations that others might miss. If anyone could help navigate this complex situation, it would be Linda. Rebecca found Linda in her office, finishing up paperwork from another case. Linda looked up as Rebecca knocked on the open door, immediately noting the anxiety etched on the nurse's face. Linda had worked with Rebecca on several cases over the years and knew her to be both competent and level-headed. If Rebecca was this concerned about a patient, there was definitely something worth investigating. "I need to talk to you about Emma Martinez in room 314, Rebecca began, closing the office door behind her for privacy. "I believe she's being abused at home, but the situation is complicated." Linda gestured for Rebecca to sit down, pulling out a fresh notepad to document their conversation. As a mandated reporter, Linda was legally required to investigate any suspicion of child abuse, but she also understood the importance of gathering as much information as possible before taking action that could potentially escalate a dangerous situation. Rebecca carefully explained her observations of Emma's behavior patterns, Derek's controlling presence, and the unusual family dynamic she had witnessed over the past several days. She described Emma's hypervigilance, her fear responses, and the dramatic behavioral changes when Derek was absent from the room. Most importantly, Rebecca explained the secret signal system she had established with Emma and how the child had used it to communicate her need for help. Linda listened intently, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions about specific incidents and behaviors. As an experienced investigator, Linda recognized that the pattern Rebecca described was consistent with psychological abuse and possibly physical abuse that was being carefully concealed. The level of fear and control Rebecca observed was not typical of normal family relationships, even in stressful circumstances. "The challenge we face," Linda explained to Rebecca, "is that we need to act on this information in a way that protects Emma without alerting Derek to what's happening. If he becomes aware that Emma has disclosed abuse, it could put her in immediate danger." Linda reviewed Emma's medical file, paying particular attention to the circumstances of her admission and Derek's explanations for her condition. The medical evidence of chronic malnutrition and dehydration was consistent with neglect, but Derek's story about Emma's eating problems provided a plausible alternative explanation that had satisfied the medical team's initial assessment. "We need to create an opportunity to interview Emma privately," Linda decided. "If she can verbally confirm what she communicated to you through the signal, we'll have grounds for protective custody. The challenge is getting her alone without Derek becoming suspicious." Linda and Rebecca developed a plan that would require careful timing and coordination. The next morning, Derek would likely step out of Emma's room at some point, as he had done several times each day since Emma's admission. When that opportunity arose, Linda would conduct a brief interview with Emma to assess her safety and determine if emergency intervention was necessary. Meanwhile, Linda began making preliminary calls to gather background information on the Collins family. She contacted Emma's school to speak with Emma's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, who had been present when Emma collapsed. She also reached out to Child Protective Services to check if there had been any previous reports or investigations involving the family. Mrs. Henderson's conversation with Linda proved enlightening. The teacher confirmed that Emma's behavior had changed significantly since her mother's remarriage to Derek. Emma had become withdrawn and anxious, often appearing tired and hungry at school. Mrs. Henderson had noticed that Emma rarely brought adequate lunches and seemed reluctant to discuss her home life, which was unusual for a previously open and talkative child. "I had concerns about Emma's well-being," Mrs. Henderson admitted to Linda during their phone conversation. "But when I tried to address it with her stepfather during parent conferences, he was very charming and explained that Emma was having adjustment difficulties with the new family structure. He seemed so concerned and involved that I felt reassured about her care." This information reinforced Linda's understanding of Derek's manipulation tactics. Abusive caregivers often presented themselves as devoted and concerned to outside observers while maintaining strict control over their victims in private. Derek's ability to explain away Emma's behavioral changes and physical symptoms had prevented school personnel from looking deeper into the situation. Child Protective Services confirmed that there were no previous reports on file for the Collins family. However, they did have records showing that Derek Collins had been investigated for domestic violence in a previous relationship 3 years earlier. While charges had been dropped when the victim recanted her statement, the pattern of behavior was noteworthy for establishing a history of potential violence in intimate relationships. As Linda gathered this background information, Rebecca returned to Emma's room for what would be her final shift caring for the child. The weight of responsibility felt enormous as she went about her normal nursing duties, knowing that the next several hours would determine whether Emma would be safe or return to an abusive environment. Derek seemed more agitated than usual during this final day of Emma's hospitalization. He made several phone calls in hushed tones, often stepping just outside Emma's room but remaining close enough to monitor her interactions with hospital staff. Rebecca noticed that Derek was asking more questions than usual about discharge procedures and timing, as if eager to remove Emma from the medical environment as quickly as possible. Emma herself appeared to be in a state of heightened anxiety as discharge time approached. She barely touched her breakfast, despite having shown improved appetite over the previous days. Her eyes followed every person who entered the room, and she seemed to be watching for some sign that her silent plea for help had been understood and acted upon. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during the late morning hours. Derek received a phone call that appeared to require his immediate attention. After speaking in low tones for several minutes, he approached Emma's bed with obvious frustration. "I have to go deal with something at work," Derek told Emma, his voice carrying an undertone of warning. "I'll be back in about an hour, and then we can finish getting ready to take you home. You be good while I'm gone, and remember what we talked about." Emma nodded obediently, but Rebecca could see the fear in her eyes intensify at Derek's mention of what we talked about. This phrase clearly carried threatening implications that only Emma understood, reinforcing Rebecca's belief that Derek had been coaching Emma on what to say and what not to say during her hospital stay. As soon as Derek left the hospital, Rebecca immediately contacted Linda through the internal paging system. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Emma was alone and available for a private interview without Derek's intimidating presence. Linda gathered her materials and headed to Emma's room, knowing that time was limited and this might be their only chance to get the truth about Emma's home situation. Linda entered Emma's room with a warm smile, introducing herself as someone who helped children with problems they might be having. She explained that her job was to make sure children felt safe and happy, and that sometimes children needed to talk to adults about things that were worrying them. Emma listened carefully to Linda's explanation, but her eyes kept darting toward the door as if expecting Derek to return at any moment. Linda recognized this hypervigilance as a classic sign of abuse trauma and adjusted her approach accordingly. Instead of asking direct questions immediately, Linda spent several minutes simply building rapport with Emma, talking about neutral topics like the stuffed animals on Emma's bedside table and the drawings she had made with Rebecca's colored pencils. Gradually, Linda began to introduce more specific topics. She asked Emma about her home life in general terms, about her relationship with her mother and stepfather, and about how she felt about going home from the hospital. Emma's responses were carefully neutral, giving no indication of problems or concerns about her family situation. Linda realized that Emma had been thoroughly coached about how to respond to such questions. Derek had likely spent considerable time preparing Emma for potential interviews with authorities, teaching her to give responses that would not raise suspicions about their home environment. This level of preparation suggested that Derek was well aware his behavior constituted abuse and had taken steps to prevent discovery. Recognizing that direct questioning was not going to be effective, Linda decided to reference the signal system that Rebecca had established with Emma. She moved closer to Emma's bed and spoke in a very quiet voice, ensuring that their conversation could not be overheard by anyone passing in the hallway. "Emma, Nurse Rebecca told me that you two have a special way of communicating when you can't use words," Linda said gently. "She explained to me about the signal you can use if you need help with something. Do you remember learning about that signal?" Emma's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. Linda could see that Emma was remembering her interaction with Rebecca and the secret signal they had discussed. More importantly, Linda could see recognition in Emma's eyes, the understanding that Rebecca had indeed understood her silent plea and was now taking action to help her. If you used that signal with Nurse Rebecca, it means you're asking for help with something that's making you feel unsafe, Linda continued carefully. I want you to know that there are adults whose job is to help children when they're not safe, and I'm one of those adults. But I can only help you if you can tell me what's making you feel unsafe. Emma looked toward the door again, checking to make sure Derek had not returned unexpectedly. When she looked back at Linda, there were tears beginning to form in her dark eyes. The internal struggle was visible on her face, the desire to ask for help warring against the fear of what might happen if she spoke the truth. Linda waited patiently, allowing Emma to process the decision she was facing. She understood that for a child who had been threatened into silence, choosing to disclose abuse required enormous courage. Emma needed to feel that the adults around her could truly protect her before she would risk speaking up about her situation. Finally, in a voice so quiet that Linda had to lean close to hear her, Emma whispered, "Derek hurts me when Mama's not home. He says nobody will believe me if I tell, and that bad things will happen to Mama if I'm not good." These words, spoken with such pain and fear, confirmed everything that Rebecca and Linda had suspected about Emma's home environment. Linda felt a surge of both relief that Emma had found the courage to disclose and determination to ensure that this brave little girl would be protected from further harm. "Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me that," Linda said softly, taking Emma's small hand in hers. "You were very brave to tell me what's been happening. Now my job is to make sure you're safe, and that Derek can't hurt you anymore." Emma's tears began to flow more freely as the weight of keeping her secret began to lift from her small shoulders. For months, she had carried the burden of Derek's abuse alone, believing that no one would help her even if they knew the truth. Now, for the first time since her nightmare began, an adult was telling her that she would be protected. Linda quickly began implementing the hospital's child protection protocols. She contacted Child Protective Services to initiate an emergency investigation and requested that a police officer trained in child interviews be sent to the hospital immediately. She also spoke with Dr. Rodriguez about extending Emma's hospital stay pending the outcome of the investigation, ensuring that Emma would remain in a safe environment while authorities gathered evidence and developed a protection plan. As Linda coordinated these emergency measures, Rebecca maintained her nursing care for Emma, providing comfort and reassurance during this frightening but necessary intervention. Emma had taken the enormous step of asking for help through her secret signal, and now the adults around her were proving that her trust had been well placed. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at St. Mary's General Hospital within 30 minutes of Linda Morrison's emergency call to Child Protective Services. Detective Chen specialized in crimes against children and had developed expertise in conducting sensitive interviews with young victims. Her approach was designed to gather necessary evidence while minimizing additional trauma to children who had already endured significant suffering. Linda briefed Detective Chen on the situation as they walked toward Emma's room. She explained Rebecca's observations, Emma's use of the secret signal, and the disclosure Emma had made about Derek's abuse. Detective Chen understood the urgency of the situation. Derek would be returning to the hospital soon, and they needed to complete their investigation and secure Emma's safety before his arrival. Emma was visibly nervous when Detective Chen entered her room, but Linda's continued presence provided some comfort. Detective Chen introduced herself in a gentle, non-threatening manner, explaining that she was there to listen to Emma's story and to help make sure she would be safe. She emphasized that Emma was not in trouble and that the adults around her believed what she was telling them. Using age-appropriate interview techniques, Detective Chen carefully guided Emma through her account of Derek's abuse. Emma described months of physical violence, emotional manipulation, and systematic deprivation that had begun shortly after her mother's marriage to Derek. The pattern that emerged was one of calculated cruelty designed to maintain control while avoiding detection by outside authorities. Emma explained how Derek would hurt her when her mother was at work, often striking her in places where bruises would not be easily visible. He had threatened that terrible things would happen to her mother if Emma ever told anyone about their special relationship. Derek had convinced Emma that her mother would lose her job, their house, and her ability to care for Emma if the truth came out about his behavior. The psychological manipulation Derek employed was sophisticated and effective. He had isolated Emma from potential sources of support by discouraging friendships and monitoring her interactions with teachers and other adults. He had systematically undermined her confidence in her own perceptions, telling her that no one would believe her stories about abuse because she was just a troubled child having difficulty adjusting to her new family. Derek had also used Emma's love for her mother as a weapon against her. He frequently reminded Emma that her mother was struggling financially and needed his support to make ends meet. He suggested that if Emma caused problems by telling lies about him, her mother would be devastated and might even blame Emma for destroying their family's chance at happiness and stability. As Emma shared her story, Detective Chen documented every detail while maintaining a supportive and encouraging demeanor. She reassured Emma repeatedly that she had done the right thing by telling the truth, and that none of the abuse was Emma's fault. This validation was crucial for Emma, who had been conditioned to believe that she was somehow responsible for Derek's treatment of her. Dr. Rodriguez joined the interview team to discuss the medical evidence that supported Emma's account of abuse. While Derek had been careful to avoid leaving obvious physical evidence, the chronic malnutrition and dehydration that had brought Emma to the hospital were consistent with systematic neglect and deprivation. The medical team also noted several old injuries that had healed improperly, suggesting a pattern of physical abuse that predated Emma's current hospitalization. As Detective Chun completed her preliminary interview with Emma, hospital security discreetly monitored the building entrances for Derek's return. The plan was to prevent Derek from accessing Emma's room until protective custody arrangements could be finalized. If Derek became aware of the investigation before these measures were in place, there was a risk that he might attempt to remove Emma from the hospital or intimidate her into recanting her statements. The timing proved crucial. Derek returned to the hospital just as Detective Chen was finishing her documentation of Emma's disclosure. Hospital security intercepted him in the main lobby, informing him that there had been a development in Emma's case that required his immediate attention. Derek was escorted to a private conference room where Detective Chen and Linda Morrison were waiting to speak with him. Derek initially maintained his facade of concerned stepfather when confronted with the allegations of abuse. He expressed shock and dismay that anyone could suggest he would harm Emma, emphasizing how much he loved her and how committed he was to her welfare. Derek suggested that Emma might be confused or mistaken, pointing to the emotional stress she had been under due to her mother's work schedule and the family's financial pressures. However, Detective Chen had extensive experience interviewing perpetrators of child abuse and recognized Derek's defensive strategies. She systematically presented the evidence against him, including Emma's detailed account of his abusive behavior, the medical findings consistent with systematic neglect, and the behavioral observations documented by hospital staff over several days. As the evidence mounted, Derek's composed demeanor began to crack. He became increasingly agitated and began making subtle threats about what would happen to Emma and her mother if the family was torn apart by these false accusations. These threats, made in the presence of law enforcement and child protection workers, only served to strengthen the case against him and demonstrated the intimidation tactics he had been using to silence Emma. Derek was arrested on charges of child abuse, endangering the welfare of a child, and making terroristic threats. He was taken into custody and transported to the county jail, where he would await formal charges and a bail hearing. His removal from the hospital environment immediately changed the atmosphere in Emma's room, as if a dark cloud had been lifted from the pediatric wing. Emma's mother, Sarah Martinez Collins, arrived at the hospital within hours of Derek's arrest. She had been contacted at work by Child Protective Services and informed about the investigation into Derek's treatment of Emma. Sarah was devastated to learn about the abuse her daughter had been suffering, and overwhelmed with guilt about her failure to recognize the signs of Derek's true nature. Sarah had genuinely believed Derek's explanations for Emma's behavioral changes and weight loss. Working double shifts to support the family had left her exhausted and grateful for Derek's apparent willingness to help care for Emma. Derek had been so skillful in his manipulation that Sarah had actually viewed him as a blessing in their lives, a caring man who had stepped in to provide stability for her and her daughter. The reunion between Emma and her mother was emotional and healing. Emma had been afraid that her mother would be angry with her for causing trouble by telling the truth about Derek, as Derek had repeatedly warned her would happen. Instead, Sarah held her daughter close and apologized repeatedly for not protecting her from harm. She assured Emma that none of the abuse was Emma's fault and that she would never again allow anyone to hurt her daughter. Linda Morrison worked with Sarah to develop a safety plan for Emma's protection going forward. While Derek was in custody, there were legal proceedings and potential bail considerations that could affect Emma's safety. Sarah would need to obtain a restraining order against Derek and take steps to ensure that he could not contact or approach Emma in the future. The hospital extended Emma's stay for an additional few days to allow time for proper safety planning and to ensure her psychological stability following the disclosure of abuse. Dr. Rodriguez wanted to monitor Emma's emotional adjustment to the dramatic changes in her family situation and ensure that she received appropriate therapeutic support. Rebecca Patterson was assigned to continue as Emma's primary nurse during this extended stay. The bond between Rebecca and Emma had been crucial to Emma's rescue, and maintaining that relationship provided comfort and stability during a tumultuous time. Rebecca was amazed by the transformation she witnessed in Emma once Derek's threatening presence was removed from her environment. Without Derek's constant supervision and intimidation, Emma's true personality began to emerge. She became more talkative and curious, asking questions about her medical care and expressing preferences about food and activities. She smiled more frequently and began to engage playfully with the child life specialists who visited her room. Most importantly, Emma began to eat regularly and showed interest in the world around her. The legal proceedings against Derek moved forward quickly due to the strength of the evidence and Emma's clear testimony. Emma worked with a specially trained child advocate who helped her prepare for the legal process while ensuring that her emotional well-being remained the top priority. The advocate explained to Emma that she had been very brave in telling the truth and that her courage had prevented Derek from hurting her or other children in the future. Derek ultimately pled guilty to multiple charges related to child abuse in exchange for a plea agreement that spared Emma from having to testify in open court. He was sentenced to several years in prison and permanent supervised probation upon release. As part of his sentencing, Derek was prohibited from having any contact with Emma or her family and was required to register with authorities if he moved to a new location. Emma's recovery from the trauma of abuse would be a long process requiring ongoing therapeutic support, but she had taken the most important step by finding the courage to ask for help. The secret signal that Rebecca had taught her had provided the lifeline Emma needed to escape from an increasingly dangerous situation. Sarah enrolled Emma in trauma-informed therapy to help her process her experiences and develop healthy coping strategies. Emma also began working with a school counselor to address the academic and social challenges that had resulted from months of abuse and psychological manipulation. Gradually, Emma began to regain her confidence and trust in the adults around her. Rebecca continued to check on Emma's progress even after she was discharged from the hospital. She had been profoundly affected by Emma's case and felt a lasting connection to the brave little girl who had trusted her enough to ask for help when words were not possible. Rebecca also used Emma's story to advocate for enhanced training in recognizing signs of child abuse among hospital staff. Emma's case became a training example for other healthcare workers about the importance of paying attention to subtle behavioral cues that might indicate abuse. The secret signal technique that Rebecca had used became part of the hospital's protocol for situations where children might be unable to verbally disclose abuse due to the presence of their abusers. Months later, Emma returned to the hospital for a follow-up visit with Dr. Rodriguez. She was a transformed child, healthy, confident, and thriving in her new environment of safety and support. When she saw Rebecca during this visit, Emma ran to her with a huge smile and showed her a drawing she had made. The drawing depicted Emma and Rebecca together in the hospital room, with the words "Thank you for helping me" written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. Rebecca treasured that drawing and kept it in her locker as a reminder of why her work mattered so much. Emma's courage in using the secret signal had not only saved her own life but had also validated Rebecca's commitment to advocacy for vulnerable children. The case reinforced Rebecca's belief that sometimes the smallest gestures, a trusted conversation, a simple hand signal, or a willingness to act on subtle signs of distress, could make the difference between life and death for a child in danger. Emma's story spread throughout the medical community as an example of how healthcare workers could serve as lifelines for children trapped in abusive situations. Her brave use of the secret signal had exposed Derek's carefully hidden cruelty and demonstrated that even young children could find ways to ask for help when given the tools and opportunity to do so safely. Today, Emma is thriving in school, has developed healthy friendships, and enjoys a close relationship with her mother. The nightmare of Derek's abuse is behind her, replaced by a future filled with possibilities and hope. Her secret signal had been heard, understood, and acted upon by adults who refused to let her suffer in silence. Sometimes the quietest cries for help are the ones that save lives.